We're thinking out loud with His Excellency Nasser Judeh in this second episode of the Diplowoman podcast. As former Deputy Prime Minister of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and its longest-serving Minister of Foreign Affairs between 2009 and 2017, Minister Judeh has had a front-row seat to all the regional and global developments of the past 15 years. In 2017, the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, invited Minister Judeh to take part as a member of his high-level advisory board on mediation. He is currently a member of the Senate in Jordan. Your Excellency, welcome to the Diplowoman podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you, Karma, and thank you to the Islam Faris Institute, and thank you to Diplowomen, and you're the pioneer behind this great initiative. So it's really a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think the last time we saw each other was in New York in September of 2019, on the margins of the 74th UN General Assembly. You were forcefully present at the launch of the Global Alliance of Regional Women Mediator Networks. I remember, like it was yesterday, I remember you started your remarks, you said, "Ladies and gentlemen," and then you looked around and you said, "Oh, there are only 4 gentlemen in the room." You seemed disappointed. It was at that moment when I realized that if the power we are seeking to share as women is the one held by men, then we should start having the conversation with men and not only amongst ourselves, which is precisely why we are happy to host you as a guest today, to validate the importance of having men speak about the women, peace, and security agenda. Us alone, it's going to be very hard for us to get the numbers up. Your Excellency, you are a great example of a he for she, of someone who through his work has continuously supported and encouraged women to be more engaged in negotiations and peace processes. But how do we really do this? I mean, in practical terms, how much of what we hear in the region about the importance of the role of women in politics, etc., is lip service? How much of it is tokenism?
Thank you very much, Karma. Let me just refer to what you said in your introduction. I remember that function on the margins of the UN General Assembly in 2019, and I remember what I said at the time. Prior to that, I took part in a workshop for women mediators 6 or 7 months before that, and I was the only man there. And there's this great picture that I have framed and put up on my wall of me with 60 women. And I said to them, to all the women there at the time, and I said, gender parity and the inclusion of women in political processes and mediation and whatever initiative, which is a right, by the way, not charity, should not come at the exclusion of men. I mean, as you said, it should be a two-way conversation, and the inclusion of women does not mean the exclusion of men. And by the same token, having no women is not right. So at the end of the day, we want gender parity, not gender imbalance in these initiatives. So, look, can we say that what we see today in governments, in NGOs, in paragovernmental organizations, and the private sector, is it ideal? Of course not. Far from it. Way short of what we want to see. But we'll get there. I mean, so long as there's the political will and the determination, we'll get there. We shouldn't just look at the negative side of things or the slow progress. We should look at what serious steps are being taken everywhere. I can't be true to myself and be honest and say that some of it is not, or most of it is not lip service or tokenism. Certainly, maybe some of it is. But let's look at the wider picture, and I believe that the wider picture shows the seriousness of intent.
Your Excellency, in 2017, Secretary General Guterres established a high-level advisory board on mediation to provide him advice in relation to conflict resolution and prevention efforts. Among the board members composed of current and former national leaders, you were selected. Tell us, what is this board all about? How much does inclusivity take center stage in your discussions?
Well, let me answer on two different fronts. I mean, first, Antonio Guterres, the current Secretary General of the United Nations, is committed to gender parity within the UN system. And he's doing a lot, concrete steps to have women in key positions in different UN organizations and departments. This high-level panel or high-level advisory board on mediation certainly reflects that. It comprises 18 members from around the world, 9 women and 9 men. So he was very, very careful to do that, because it reflects his policy and his belief and his determination to have gender parity, not just within the UN system itself, but also the high-level panels and advisory boards that are offshoots of his initiative. The idea is this advisory board. I mean, you have the obvious conflicts around the world, for which we have special envoys or key specific UN departments and organizations that deal with these conflicts. You have a special envoy for Yemen, a special envoy for Libya, a special envoy for Afghanistan. But there are conflicts that are off the radar screen. There are conflicts that are perhaps not so visible or not in the headline news every day. And the Secretary General set up this advisory board to help him with dealing with such conflicts, and also that doesn't preclude helping with the obvious conflicts as well, using the advisory board as a sounding board for some of the work that the special envoys are doing in different hotspots or conflicts around the world. So we've met 4 times so far. The composition of the board is actually quite interesting, because like I said, you've got women, you've got men. A lot from Africa, from Latin America, from the Far East, from the Middle East, from Europe. And so the idea is just to brainstorm. And sometimes when there's a specific mission, the Secretary General would task one of the members of the high-level advisory board to actually physically go to a country or a region that is that either has a conflict or a conflict brewing in the making, to pass on a message, if they accept, of course, to have UN involvement in that. So it's a very interesting board, and the topics are extremely interesting.
According to the Global Peace Index, the Middle East is the least peaceful region in the world. And we have 4 major conflicts that we see around us. And you have said in many of your speeches that women are the most impacted. They're those who carry the brunt of these conflicts. And all the research has shown that when women are more involved in negotiations and peace processes, it is then when you have more and more sustainable peace, you have more just peace, you have positive peace in societies. My question to you is, what are Arab governments today really doing to include more women in the high-level peace processes, in the high-level talks, in the negotiations? And where do you see more intervention being needed?
Well, you're absolutely right in pointing to the fact that whether I said it or many other people have said it, I mean, it's a blinding flash of the obvious that women are the most affected by any conflict. Women lose their husbands, fathers, brothers, sons in conflicts when they are internally displaced or become refugees. They're the ones who have to take care of their families, and therefore it only makes sense. It's common sense, actually, and quite logical for women to be involved in mediation efforts. And that takes us back to the advisory board on mediation, but also to be involved in negotiations and in the production of peaceful outcomes to conflict. It only makes sense because they're the most affected, and they would be, if they come from a vantage point, sometimes from a point of disadvantage, unfortunately, where the key issues are presented on the table without any sugarcoating. So Yes, and you're right. We come from a region that has sadly and unfortunately historically provided the world with much instability, and whether it's direct or indirect or spillover or ripple effect, name it what you want. Right now we're talking about Libya, Syria, Yemen, and of course what we refer to as the root cause of all conflict, which is the Palestinian issue. And so this is very it's very sad. We've seen we have conflicts all over the world, but the concentration of conflicts in our region it makes it imperative for all of us to women, men, everyone to do our utmost to bring about peaceful outcomes. So look, if the Palestinian question remains unresolved, if the Palestinians are unable to have their own independent sovereign state on their national soil, if the occupation does not end, this is a conflict that has gone on now since 1948. And even before that, you know, the turbulence that happened before that. But we are now talking about an obvious two-state solution that will bring about the outcome that we all want. Unfortunately, without undermining or lessening the importance or severity of the other conflicts, but we keep reminding that this is the root cause of much of the instability that we see, not just in our part of the world, but generally around the world altogether. So, and women have to be involved. They have to be involved in peacemaking. They have to be involved in mediation. They have to be involved in shaping what their future looks like, not just at the receiving end of what comes their way.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Your Excellency, in 2014, you attended the Global Summit to End Sexual Violence and Conflict in London. This was co-chaired by your dear friend William Hague and Angelina Jolie. The Global Summit was the largest gathering of its kind, which shed light on this grave issue. Rape, sexual slavery, trafficking, forced early marriages are just a few examples of crimes, of weapons of war used against girls and women. What do we do in the Arab world to put these issues in the forefront of our political discussions?
Well, that's why it was called the Global Summit, because there were 120 countries represented in June 2014 over 3 days or 4 days. In fact, it was a whole month of activities, but the core of it was the 3 or 4 days in June. 120 countries, again, over 1,000 experts. It included everyone from youth organizations to NGOs to specialists, and the idea was to break the taboos around wartime rape and to try and shatter the culture of impunity. What was the expression that we all used at the time? People had to realize that there had to be support, unwavering support for engendering a global shift in attitude towards sexual violence. And the idea behind having, like I said, 120 countries and all sorts of experts and all sorts of victims, by the way, and witnesses to these atrocities, is to transform world opinion. And I believe that it succeeded in a way in changing the perspective, changing the understanding of all that. And while we all concluded at the time that government action is essential when it comes to changing the norm and changing the misunderstandings and misconceptions, but there was a lot of inspiration during those days in London. There was a lot of inspiration that was drawn from survivors and from activists and from witnesses to these horrific realities. And I believe that one of the extremely pertinent outcomes of the summit was to launch an international protocol on documentation and investigation of sexual violence and conflict, and to set new international standards. And I think that was a great outcome. I hope that there will be a follow-up summit, perhaps. I don't know. This was 2014. There's been many activities since then, but to have another summit at some stage would be a very, very important step.
Absolutely. I remember that summit very well. And I remember how many of us thought that this was a breakthrough, gathering, a breakthrough initiative. Do you feel like in the Arab world, 7 years down the line, do you see more progress when it comes to these issues? Have taboos been broken? Are we more comfortable talking about these things? Many of our countries still, allow for early marriages, early child marriage. How do you view the situation right now, the state of play of our nations?
Karma, we live in an integrated world these days. You can't escape reality. You can't escape the fact that with social media and with internet and with access to information and with these modern tools of communication that we all have and enjoy and have started to take for granted, that a story can remain hidden or suppressed, or that it's not going to reach the public, not just in your country or region, but around the world. Something that happens in the far corner of the world is automatically seen simultaneously, real time, by everyone who wishes to access that information. Sometimes even if you don't wish to access that information, it comes your way without you asking for it. So I believe this has emboldened people, encouraged people to speak out against injustice, against personal stories, some of it extremely tragic, to attract world attention, international attention, to a regional problem within a specific country. There is no way. I mean, I know from my own country, from Jordan, I'm sure in Lebanon it's the same, and in every country, you can't. Sorry to use a common expression, but you can't get away with murder anymore. I mean, if you commit a crime, if you commit an injustice, if you go against the norms of civilization, if you have something that is an outrage to morality, as we know it, it's going to be known. By and large, it's going to be known, and it's going to be dealt with and addressed. So I believe this is the world that we live in, and perhaps this is all for the better. I believe when stories break out, when stories they become known and visible, you have nothing to do except try to make the situation better. So.
Agreed. I think it's very hard to hide some of these stories, and we're at a place where, it's like there's a world theater and everyone is watching. And like you said, this culture of impunity is on its way out of the door, inshallah, as we say, hopefully. Your Excellency, tell me a little bit about Jordan. I mean, you represented this country for many years on the global stage, and what's happening right now in Jordan when it comes to the role of women in politics, in peace processes and negotiation? How many female ambassadors are there in Jordan? Can you just share with us some interesting insights and some stories, anecdotes that you've had over the years that shows, your cooperation or the involvement of women in some of these key matters, key issues?
Well, without blowing our own trumpet when it comes to the inclusion of women in public affairs, but factually speaking,
please do.
we were pioneers in that, pioneers in the context of the region, but I mean, women have been in leadership positions in both the public and private sector and in the military for decades. This is not new for us. Our first female government minister, cabinet minister, was Amil al-Mufti in 1979. She was Minister for Social Development. We had many women in cabinet since, in political portfolios, as well as service and social development, and in the economic ministries as well. We've had a female deputy prime minister before. Our first lady who was referred to as a captain pilot of an aircraft in Royal Jordanian was Taghreed Akasha back in 1984, I think. And you see, this is the interesting point here. It's not just the fact that a woman became a pilot, an airline pilot, 40 years ago. It's the common perception is that a male-dominated, oriented society would not accept that. I remember flying in a plane that was captained by Taghreed Akasha, and when she announced herself as "Dear passengers, this is Taghreed Akasha, your captain speaking," I didn't see any raised eyebrows. I didn't see any shock, looks of shock and horror. And on the contrary, everybody was smiling and cheering. So it's also the culture of acceptance of something like that. Women in the military in Jordan, that has been going since the 1950s. We had at first in the nursing field in the army. I mean, we had the Princess Mona Nursing College. The first graduates were first lieutenants back in 1965. And then we had female officers in other pursuits and disciplines, not just in nursing, in administrative, and key. We have women in the Air Force. So we've been doing a lot in Jordan. I mean, during the reign of His late Majesty King Hussein, I mean, this was one of his priorities, and His Majesty King Abdullah is continuing the same tradition and reinforcing that perception that women are equal members of our system. It's not one or the other, it's both. And so, we're very, very proud of that. When I was foreign minister, the three, I don't want to make comparisons of which embassies are important, all our embassies are important. But at one point, our ambassador to Washington, D.C., in Washington, D.C., our ambassador in London, and our permanent representative to the United Nations in New York were all ladies, the three of them at the same time. So imagine me having to deal with that.
I think it was a privilege to deal with that.
It was a real privilege, but I also had to accept that many a time I would be told not to do things in very firm terms.
So you felt marginalized, Your Excellency.
It was a pride and honor, truly. Joking aside, it was always a sense of pride for me to say, this is our ambassador to the United States. This is our ambassador to the United Kingdom. This is our permanent representative in the United Nations. And they all did fantastic jobs. And during my tenure as foreign minister, at one point maybe we had 6 or 7 lady ambassadors out of 60, not what we wanted. But don't forget that this is a process in the foreign ministry, in the foreign service.
Absolutely.
But now, if you look at the spectrum of our foreign service officers in different levels, you'll see that many more women are there. And in time, perhaps in 5 to 10 years' time, you're going to have almost an equal number of ambassadors, both female and male. So it's a culture that takes time. It's a process that has to play out its course, because in the foreign service, as you know, you either enter at the bottom or at the top. You're either an attaché right at the bottom of the ladder, or you come in as an ambassador, as a political appointee. But for an attaché to work themselves out, he or she work themselves up the ladder, it's a process of 15 to 20 years to become an ambassador. But now we're seeing that taking root and happening. So.
And I mean, you said this before as well, that we need
by the way, to this day, our ambassador in Washington is a lady.
Dina, no? Dina Kawar.
And our permanent representative in New York is a lady. And our ambassador to the European Union in Brussels is a lady also.
Well, I want to take this opportunity also to send a big hello and a shout out to your female ambassadors and to Jordanian women in general, who have, really been at the forefront of this attempt at cultural change. As you said, it's a cultural process. It's a change that we need to, slowly start to initiate, but also try to speed up as much as we can. And you've said this before, we have to change the landscape and the discourse for participation to take place. So I feel like from the way you're speaking, you're on the right track. And maybe...
I hope so. I hope so. But again, I want to stress that we men sometimes fall into the trap of approaching this in a patronizing way, or as if we're performing an act of charity. Or this is very wrong. If we're talking about inclusion and gender parity, we have to accept that this is a right, not something that is given by us men. It is a right. Women are half the society, if not sometimes more. I mean, look at Jordan today. I mean, you have more women than men in our population, quite honestly. If you look at, and by the way, I mentioned a few. I mentioned the airline, I mentioned the army, and I mentioned the ministers and the ambassadors. But in all walks of life here in Jordan, bankers, economists, think tank heads, journalists, they're doing an extremely good job, and it's not my place to pass judgment on how they're doing. You know, just like it's not my place to pass judgment on men performing the same jobs and duties. So let's accept that this is a right. Again, not an act of charity, not something that we are, generously giving to women. It is their right.
This is music to my ears. So thank you for sharing that. Peacekeeping operations. I know that Jordan has been long involved as a troop contributing country to certain peacekeeping operations, but we still see that female peacekeepers across the world, their numbers are not as high as we would like them to be. Can you just give me a little bit some insight of how you think we can increase the number of female peacekeepers in peacekeeping operations across the world?
We are actually one of the largest contributors to peacekeeping operations in the world, both police and army. Police, I think we're number one. At one point, we were number,
In female.
No.
Okay.
In contributions to peacekeeping in general.
Okay.
But like I said, relative as a ratio to the population,
yes.
I think one of the largest contributors, second or third when it comes to army, and first at one point when it came to police. And we had female peacekeepers in both. I'll give you an example. I think, by the way, I agree with you. I think there should be more inclusion of women in peacekeeping operations around the world. But I'll give you a very nice and quite telling example. When we had our peacekeepers in Afghanistan, for example, first of all, we have a field hospital in Mazar-e Sharif, but we also sent imams from the armed forces, army imams, to try and in the atmosphere that we knew then of radicalization and perhaps misperceptions of the core message of Islam. And so we had imams, but the male imams, could not enter certain areas where the predominant population are women. And so we had to send women scholars in the army from our armed forces to go and talk to these ladies and tell them, look, this is what Islam is all about. This is the core message of Islam, of openness, of moderation, of peace, of love, of acceptance. And they played a very important role in some of the towns and villages of Afghanistan. So we are very proud of our peacekeeping, of our contribution to peacekeeping around the world. They've done a fantastic job in all the posts that they went to in Africa, in Haiti, in the Far East. And we'll continue with that.
So what advice do you give men? What advice do you give men, specifically those who are in politics and diplomacy, about creating real partnerships with women, to have equal and just governance structures and an inclusive foreign policy?
The only advice that I would give men is stop thinking about it. It's not something that you have to give constant thought to. This is something that you have to accept as a given, as something that you have to accept as a right. Again, if you reach that conclusion and start operating by that code, then you'll stop thinking about it and stop worrying about whether you're doing it right or doing it wrong. Just accept the principle, and you'll be doing it right.
That's fantastic advice. Your Excellency, Nasser Judeh, thank you for being with us as a guest on the Diplomat podcast.
It's a real pleasure, Karman. Thank you, and thanks to your team, your professional team. I think this is a great initiative, and I will be extremely privileged to be part of it, involved with it. somehow from afar, from a close distance, at your disposal all the time.
Thank you, and please continue being a staunch supporter of gender equality in our region.
Absolutely, beyond any doubt.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good luck.